Right, well I've been obviously back on eBay, given the eBay style packaging that we've got here, and this is a little bit of a video for me, as well as some people that have also been asking in the comments, because the HD7770 is now complete bargain bin territory. And it makes sense, these are a little bit old now, but this was my first properly decent graphics card, at least on a modern platform. It's amazing to see that this one is meant to be new in box and cost me about £6. So I figured for £6, this is a graphics card you can easily get. When things are in bargain bin territory, they cost nothing. So why don't we get this open and see just what we've got. So we've got a bit of bubble wrap, and this here is a Sapphire 7770 Overclock edition. You only get 1 gig of GDDR5 on these. Most of them only did come with 1 gigabyte. Occasionally you find one with a couple. I mean, this is just a bit of nostalgia for me, because despite this actually being still a relatively supported graphics card, it is a little bit retro now. I mean, what have you got on the box? GCN 28nm, the radically new GCN architecture in Sapphire's HD7000 series is built to dominate tomorrow's games and today's. That's actually true. That's one of the reasons these are still good. GCN was very ahead of its time. GDDR5, Eyefinity was pretty cool. Crossfire, mostly useless these days. PCIe 3, AMD app acceleration, I suppose media work. DirectX 11, but that's actually a bit of a lie, because these are even better at DirectX 12. We've got HDMI, and oh yes, Blu-ray movies in stereoscopic 3D. Pricing, nothing like that on there. It's a shame. I would have loved to have seen what someone paid for this back in the day, but why don't we get this open? Because they have sellotaped it all back together, which is fair enough. So what do we actually get inside? Oh, it's all here. Did anyone actually use this? We get our Sapphire card, quick install guide, the classic. And you did used to get these, because I had a couple of Sapphire cards and they knew a lot of people running these were going to run them in OEM computers. You get a rather well overbuilt Molex to 6-pin, which is good enough to power one of these. We don't need that today, but that's a bit of nostalgia. An assorted bit of plastic. We have the crucial, and I still have a few of these, because I'm fairly sure this is where my one came from, the translucent DVI to VGA adapter, because you do actually get a surprisingly solid VGA signal out of these. And then we have the graphics card itself. Stop. You must connect this graphics card to the computer's power supply, which is why they give you one of those dongles. And there it is. This is actually one of the really nice ones. This is the Vapor X, which is a little bit showy for what is an entry-level graphics card, but hey, I mean, this was the card to get if you wanted to play all games of its era for about £60–70. I mean, that's what I paid. Hey, I mean, someone probably overpaid on this when they could have got something better, but if you couldn't afford a 750 Ti, which was quite common because they were always out of stock, this is what you got instead. And it was cheaper, and from my memory, this was great. Right, so I have gone ahead and just installed some drivers. They're the latest Nemes modded drivers, or RDN ID, whatever they're calling themselves now, and it does mean the card does show up as the R7 250X, but it is just a full HD 7770, 640 unified shaders, 1 gig of VRAM, 16 ROPs, 40 TMUs. Honestly, not bad specifications. I have no clue how it's going to do today, because, I mean, this is a graphics card I bought myself 14 years ago, and to be fair, we did just look at the 750 Ti, which this was kind of up against, and maybe this is a good idea for some people. I mean, the 750 Ti still sells for stupid money, but these, no one wants them. I mean, I wanted one back when they were new, but you never know, and maybe there is something good about them. I am just going to go ahead and get a baseline score. I know a decent chunk about these cards, and I'm thinking, for certain people in the world, I mean, on AliExpress, these are still quite a big seller because they're very cheap if you need one in, say, a country that just can't get a hold of graphics cards, and no one's really talking about it. But, you know, I've got a bit of a personal connection to these, and there's going to be a lot of Nvidia coming up soon, so I thought, why not revisit one of the classics that, I mean, when was the last time we looked at one of these? 3–4 years ago? A lot has changed since then, especially in terms of how we benchmark things on the channel, so chances are this will probably be the last time we ever look at one of these, because, I mean, are we ever going to need to look at it again? I suppose we'll wait and see. Also, these things still get updated drivers over on Linux. And of course, as we know, Linux has just had a patch put out by Valve, which enables VRAM optimization. So I'm sure we'll get into that later on in the video, because as a cheap Linux card, I could definitely see this being viable. But Anyway, let's just run it through Time Spy real quick, get a baseline score, go from there. We're going to do a little bit of overclocking, see if it launches a game of some sort, and then get straight into things, because there's nothing about this card that hasn't already been said by both myself and, of course, lots of other people that have covered it. Long story short, people loved them at the time because they were cheap and they played everything. And because of the underlying architecture, they did last a lot longer than people were expecting. Despite being worse than 750 Ti on launch, there was a weird overlap era where AMD had Mantle, which would go on to become Vulkan, where this sort of overtook its Nvidia competition, especially the older cards from Nvidia, and of course its predecessor like the Terascale 5770 and 6770 and cards like that. It sort of lucked out by being released with the right architecture at the right time. I don't imagine performance here is going to be great because we're already using all our VRAM up, so it's done about average, which I would expect. It's only a 1GB version of the card, and of course 3D Mark will be comparing it against the 250X, which is the same card, but a lot of them came with 2 gigs of VRAM, so not exactly surprised by that score, but also not really disappointed either. So if we increase the power limit, 1250, no. So we can do about 1200 on core. Also must be said, this cooler is completely overkill. That seems a little bit high, 1500. I think this one will crash it. I know my 7770s, that is too high. So 1450 on memory, we'll let it restart, dial those back in. I don't think this overclock will make too much difference because, well, we're so memory bound, unfortunately. Time Spy really does like to have 2 gigs because, well, it's from an era where games wanted 2 gigs and it was trying to be reminiscent of them, and this is a very real-world situation where this card sort of falls apart. So we've gained a few extra points by overclocking, but really this is set up so well out of the box. It's not like later AMD cards. These genuinely were a case of so many of the manufacturers, even the awful VTX one I bought, was set up really nicely out of the box, and this Sapphire one is no exception, but I've decided to launch up GTA 5 just to remind myself how it used to run back in the day, and you got to play it with high settings, normal textures, you could turn up the shadow settings. I believe I used to have AMD CHS enabled. Turn on CHS. CHS enabled did give a 10 FPS dip in the frame rate, but CHS shadows in GTA 5 Legacy, honestly, at the time, there was a reason why I turned them on, because I was willing to take a 10 FPS hit just to have them, and with these settings, does look exceptionally good. You've got to remember, these were the kind of visuals you were getting on an entry-level graphics card that you bought 3 years before this game came out on PC. So this was literally what was in my computer. I already had so much faith in this graphics card that I knew it would run. And to be fair, this is how I remember it running. High settings, fancy shadows enabled, and a decent draw distance and view distance all turned up, and you just about get away with it being a decent experience. I mean, don't get me wrong, we are definitely saturating the VRAM because the card is at around 90% utilization, because our VRAM pool is full, but I don't really care because it's enough to deliver me 30 to 40 FPS with great looking visual. And you remember, a lot of people that bought these will be people like me, where they saw the price of the Xbox One and thought, I'm not paying that. I would rather build a computer. And I built a PC with an FX 4300 and this graphics card. Not one that's nice, but this graphics card, and it delivers a much better experience because, well, we're getting a higher frame rate than the Xbox with better visuals, and it's still able to do it. How many years? 14 years later? But really, we can be nostalgic about this as much as we want. We already knew it would run GTA 5 Legacy. What we actually need to see is how does it run things in the modern day. So I'm going to get running it through some benchmarks, and it's time to find out. So what was AMD's HD7770, and why do I sound so nostalgic about it? Well, for myself, and a lot of people that got into PC gaming in this era think around the release of the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, this was the budget AMD graphics card to have. Now, I'm not going to complain about the value the 7850, 7870, 7950, 7970, and all the other great HD 7000 series cards that were out there offered, but what I am going to say is, this card was so easily available in virtually all markets, it's why I ended up with one. The 750 Ti was out of my budget because, due to how in demand they were, trying to find one at MSRP was nearly impossible when they were actually in stock, but these 7770s were everywhere. My first one was a pretty bad VTX model, but even that came out of the box at over 1 GHz. And given it was very similar to the hardware in the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, it meant that you could pretty much play all the console-style games at usually better settings, because you usually weren't held back by mediocre Jaguar processor cores. And of course, it's almost a perfect storm for this to have been AMD's perfect budget card, which is one of the reasons they rebranded it so much. You could get this in the R7 250X, the 350, the 350X. They rebranded this so many times with cuts here and boosts here, and pretty much they all ended up performing in and around the same, but it was a perfect storm. See, AMD supported Mantle on these cards, which would go on to become Vulkan, which inadvertently gave these great Vulkan and DirectX 12 support long after a lot of cards this era just couldn't perform all too well with it. So it became a really long-lived card, to the stage where, when this channel was new, which was around 2017-2018, I was recommending these as a great budget option, and we're now nearly 10 years on from that point, and it's still just about kicking. At the same time though, I did put out a community poll telling people I was making this video, and the amount of comments that all agreed with the same sentiment that I'm talking about here, where they bought one in that 2012 to 2013 era, or picked one up cheap a few years later, the amount of gaming they got done on these is just absolutely insane, because for games of their era, you're looking at 1080p with high or medium settings depending if you're targeting 30 or 60 FPS, and on recent titles, not much has really changed. It still targets similar resolutions and settings. So what you ended up with is a budget card that people got nearly a decade out of use out of, and then add to the fact there's modded drivers, you got a few more years out of it on top of that as well. So it's good to see that a lot of people do share my love of this graphics card, because no, it wasn't the best value in terms of price to performance, but if it's all you could afford, then it did a damn good job. So for such a legendary budget graphics card, just what are the specifications? Well, this here is the Radeon HD7770, which is an awful lot of a mouthful to say, but I've said it so much over the years I've got used to it. And it was pretty much the first budget graphics card on the GCN1 architecture, being Cape Verde on 28nm. You get 1GB of GDDR5, occasionally you'll come across a card with 2GB, but most people that were buying these were buying them due to budget constraints, and only got the 1GB. There's a 128-bit memory bus, and drivers are still available through modded routes, either the NEMES or the rebranded RDNID routes, which really you are better off running. These are a lot more stable and do offer a performance increase, at least as long as you aren't running synthetic tasks, and to be fair, if you're benchmarking GCN 1 to 3, you might as well just go with them. You get 640 cores, 40 TMUs, 16 ROPs, and you do have a decent chunk of DirectX 12 and Vulkan support. I've also noted that it is similar-ish to the Xbox One. It's not quite the Xbox One's graphics card. I have done a video on it with one that is pretty much one-to-one with the specifications, but, you know, a lot of people did call this the Xbox One's graphics card, and rightly so. At the time, it usually beat it or performed similar as the years went on. You can pick these up today for genuinely nothing. If you bid on an auction like I did, you will likely be the only person bidding on it, because at this point it is a budget graphics card that is 14 years old. When it comes to overclocking the HD7770, it's something pretty much everyone did, and if you didn't, well, chances are your manufacturer you bought it from already had. This Sapphire one is set up very nicely from the box, but we were able to eke out an extra 50 points over in Time Spy, which isn't a great deal because we were heavily VRAM bound, but at the same time, free performance is free performance. If we take a little look at how the graphics card progresses through the synthetic benchmarks, we can see great DirectX 10 performance, very good entry-level DirectX 11 benchmarks with Skydiver, which isn't a test we usually run, but I wanted to get these all out the way because chances are we won't be looking at this card again, and in Firestrike we see a passable 3576. What is interesting though is if we look at an entry-level DirectX 12 test, I've never ran Night Raid before, but I've managed to get a little bit of data for it, and it does appear that it's very similar in demand to Skydiver, which makes sense, it's an entry-level task.
The thing is though, it can clearly show how well this card deals with DirectX 12. They're very similar in terms of intensity, but all it's using is a new API, and we see our score go up by well over 1,000, which is a clear selling point of the HD7770. It deals with these new APIs very well. However, DirectX 12 support is good, but unfortunately we still only have 1GB of VRAM, which in the modern day with titles like Time Spy, Steel Nomad Lite, I am amazed it actually managed to complete Steel Nomad, which usually wants 5 to 8 gigs of VRAM, and as you can see, the card pretty much flatlines its way down to 64 points, with a slight uplift in Steel Nomad Lite showing that newer, more well-optimized titles may have a chance of running, but that's why we do these progressions, is to see how the card's getting on synthetically. If we compare the card in a benchmark of its era with Firestrike, we can see that it sits pretty close to a Vega 7, which is quite impressive, but is nowhere near the GTX 750 Ti that people were often pining over back in the day. Moving into Time Spy though, and we can see the 7770 is down the bottom of the graph, now performing worse than a GTX 745, and that's because we've only got 1GB of VRAM here, and the 4GB of slow DDR3 on the abysmal 745 do actually give it more longevity. Even with an API, it's usually not very good at. Now, for the benchmarks today, we aren't going to be focusing too much on legacy titles. There's a couple of them in there, but not really too many. I've tried to push this through our up-to-date, as of 2026, benchmarking suite, which means I will be trying to launch as much of this on the 7770 as possible, and if it doesn't work, I will try and tweak it down till it does, because this is likely going to be the last time we ever look at this card, and let's be honest, if you are interested in legacy benchmarks, well, there are plenty of videos by channels that aren't just this one covering this legendary card, so don't worry, the information is out there, and I'm sure I will touch on it briefly somewhere towards the end of the video. But as it stands today, we want to find out, is the HD7770 finally obsolete? I mean, most of the specifications would indicate it is, but it does still have a good degree of community support. It's still a very popular card on the used market, maybe not so much in the UK and the US and Europe these days, but in other countries it is still a popular choice. And is there a reason for this? Is that underlying GCN architecture that good that even in this basic budget form with just 1GB of VRAM, is it enough to still blow us away? And the only way to find out is with the benchmarks. Starting things off, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which we were able to run with normal textures, and a lot of the other options turned up to high with HBAO enabled. Now, we didn't have any anti-aliasing, so there's no TAA or anything like that going on here, but we were actually able to manage a 1080p resolution with 42 FPS on average, and remarkably solid frame times down to 1% lows of 35 FPS. Which I wasn't really expecting here, given this is the latest release of GTA 5, and we're running it on the equivalent of an Xbox One's graphics card, so really they could have actually made a slightly more enhanced version for that console over there, but that's besides the point. At the end of the day, this was a rather impressive start that I wasn't expecting, and sort of sets the tone for the benchmarks a little bit, because even as we moved on to GTA Online Enhanced Edition with the exact same settings, our average actually went up by 1 frame per second, which is enough to be margin of error stuff because it pretty much ran the same as single player, but this was in a fully packed lobby, and our 1GB of VRAM wasn't proving to be a problem. It does appear that GTA 5 Enhanced Editions, well, its VRAM estimations are very, very pessimistic, because apparently we should be using 3GB of it right now, and we're just not. It works perfectly. Just as a quick reminder of how the legacy version of the game is running, and I'm playing it with the same settings that I used to back when this game first came out, which was normal textures, with most of the game turned up to high and AMD CHS shadows enabled. Genuinely, if you've not dabbled around with them, I really do think the CHS shadows really enhance the feel of the game. It could be nostalgia because that's how I used to play it back at the time, but to be fair, make up your own mind, the visuals are on screen. We returned 41 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 33 FPS. This makes sense, we have a few more intensive effects turned up, and at the same time this is utilising DirectX 11, not DirectX 12, which, as we've already seen from the synthetic testing, is something that this card deals with fine, but DirectX 12 was really where it began to stand out. And if we move on to the GTA Online Legacy version, which is usually a nightmare to run, mysteriously it was working okay today. This was in a fully packed out lobby, and usually we'd see performance suffer greatly, but this time we were still averaging over 30 FPS with the same settings. And I was fully prepared to have to turn things down, but nope, 36 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 30 FPS, which really isn't that bad. But what about those competitive shooters, things like Counter-Strike 2? Now it must be said the modded drivers do help out quite a lot here, as they always tend to with these competitive games, but running it with low settings in 1080p to start off, and we saw 92 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 71 FPS through the built-in benchmark, which isn't actually a bad showing, so in simpler scenarios, you can actually get away with just shy of 100 FPS on average in these simpler maps. However, if you did want to drop it down to the competitive resolution of 1280 by 960, we saw that we now averaged a really rather good 138 FPS on average, with 1% lows that were just north of 100 frames per second. So really, this isn't actually a terrible card for Counter-Strike 2 in simpler instances. The problem is, when you start moving away from these maps into something more intensive, say like the latest release of Cash, and well, our frame rate pretty much halves itself, now averaging 58 FPS, which is just close enough to 60 to be playable, but with 1% lows down to 41 FPS, so no longer a competitive card, but hey, for a card that cost me £6 today, and one that I picked up myself 13 years ago, I'm going to say this is actually passable. I wasn't actually expecting this to run at anywhere over 30 FPS, yet alone close to 60. But here's one that was a surprise. See, Arc Raiders, I thought we'd run into a VRAM error or something like that, but no. Now, Arc Raiders has a very good way of dealing with VRAM limitations and does just stop the game loading in certain assets, so you will spend 5 minutes waiting around for a tree to load in if that's actually what you want to see. But what actually matters was, with low settings in 720p with no anti-aliasing or upscaling going on, there's no point even trying to dabble around with FSR, you've not got enough VRAM to handle the overheads of it, but we were still able to achieve 33 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 26 FPS. In a game that came out well over a decade since this budget card existed. Which is why, as much as I thought this was going to be a very sad video where it's like it can't do things anymore, Arc Raiders went to show that if a title is optimized enough, it does in fact still run on a 7770 in a HD resolution. Admittedly, it doesn't look pretty, but it is in and around 30 FPS. However, on the other end of the spectrum, games like Fortnite used to run absolutely fine on cards like this. But unfortunately today, it didn't matter what I did, I tried dabbling around with config files, which is something I've never even tried to do in Fortnite. I tried different drivers, I tried rolling things back to official versions and older official versions, but we always came across the same instance. We could load into game, we could load into the lobby, but then going actually into a game of Fortnite itself would actually restart the entire computer, which is something that does appear to be documented online. Lots of people in the forums are blaming it on overheating and bits and pieces like that. It's not. I even tried underclocking the card for stability, and there's no dice. Unfortunately, Fortnite just doesn't appear to work on these cards anymore, and it purely could be anti-cheat conflicting with these older drivers. I'm not too sure, but unfortunately, no dice here. On the other end of the spectrum though, we have PUBG. Now a lot of us that probably bought this graphics card back in the day, this is the game that made me upgrade away from it. I moved to an R9 285 and then the R9 Fury after this, purely because PUBG was all the rage at the time and it was a bit of a nightmare to run, and it never ran very well on these lower VRAM or lower powered cards. But fortunately, with the introduction of the DirectX 12 renderer, which as we've seen does actually boost performance here on these GCN1 cards, we were able to eke out 44 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 33 FPS in a rather respectable 900p resolution. Now we did have to use very low settings, but to be fair, the people that are actively playing this competitively are using very low settings, probably higher draw distances than this though. So you know what, I'm actually amazed, because PUBG is one of those games that was never playable on DirectX 11, at least not very well, but now with DirectX 12, does actually work fine on the HD7770. Next up we have the latest release of BeamNG, which we were able to run with the low preset with traffic enabled in the jungle map in a 720p resolution, which is quite a mouthful to say, but generally what I was trying to do was try and take an intensive map and actually load as much traffic as we could in without the card actually just delivering about a stuttery mess, which is one of the reasons why we dropped down to a 720p resolution. If you don't have the traffic enabled or you're in simpler maps, 900p or 1080p are on the cards, but if you actually want to play this with the traffic enabled, 720p is going to be the best you can do. This still returned us 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS. There wasn't a great deal of stuttering, and the actual stuttering there was when you first loaded in disappeared quite quickly, so BeamNG dealt with this card absolutely fine. Honestly, I was expecting us to have to go to simpler maps or disable the traffic and bits and pieces like that purely because of that 1GB of VRAM, but simply lowering the resolution means that even in intensive situations like this, well, the HD7770 is still getting by. But there should be no way this card can run Cyberpunk. I'm fairly sure all of us remember the mess that Cyberpunk was on the Xbox One and PS4, where it was pretty much unplayable with a frame rate in the single digits or low teens most of the time, and the bugs that came with it. But it turns out with my ultra low config, there's a full video where we get the game running on 1GB of VRAM. It's not quite as playable here because, well, despite the VRAM, this card doesn't really have the power for the game, whereas the version we tested it with, the 7850 with 1GB, is substantially more powerful. It's enough to bring us up to a 28 FPS average with 1% lows down to 22 FPS, which in a lot of simpler instances would return us 30 to 40 FPS. But of course, when I do the Cyberpunk benchmark, I'm not just looking at a wall, we are actively playing Cyberpunk. And it was controllable, and if you really were enough of a masochist, you probably could get through the game like this. The reality is though, driving in high speeds would bring you to the mid-20s, and combat would bring you down to the low 20s. It's only when not much was going on would you see over 30 FPS. Once again, there's no point talking about FSR or upscalers, you have 1GB of VRAM, and we are already using all of it just to manage the game by itself. Next up we have Mount & Blade Bannerlord, which tends to run really well on AMD cards this era. I don't know if it's something they specifically optimized for, but given this is a DirectX 11 title, you wouldn't expect it to perform as well as it's doing here. The game defaulted to low textures with a low texture streaming buffer. It's an actual setting in the game so you can set how much VRAM you ideally want it to use, and the game also enabled medium settings with a few fancy effects also enabled from there in a 900p resolution. Genuinely, I do not know how the developers of this game have done it, because it delivered near a 60 FPS experience on this HD7770 while also looking remarkably good. So we returned 52 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 43 FPS. Once again, this benchmark is very reminiscent of the late game, so with these settings selected, lots of the early to mid game will run at 60 to 80 FPS on this ancient mid-range card, which is surprisingly good. City Skylines is one of those fan favourite games that people are always requesting to see, and to be fair, we have seen it run on a HD7770 before, but for those of you that are interested in the current performance, provided you are using the FPS Boost mod, which just fixes a UI bug because otherwise your UI updates about 10,000 times a second, you'll get about 3 to 5 frames per second on a card like this. As long as you're running that, you can run low and medium settings in a full HD 1080p resolution and return 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 33 FPS, which is really rather decent. So we were just playing around with City Skylines once again every time I get caught up, because we've been using the same benchmark town that progressively gets built upon and built upon and built upon as we go through benchmarking this. So if you go back 6 months or so in videos when we added it back into the benchmark suite, you'll notice it's a tiny village, and now we're nearing into a decent sized city. Anyway, that's besides the point. City Skylines works perfectly fine still, but you do need that mod to keep it playable. Next up we have Hitman, but unfortunately with low settings in 720p, it really does mark the end of this card. Even this game is fantastically well optimized and runs very well on most hardware, but the reality is, when you only have 1GB of VRAM, no amount of DirectX 12 performance boosts, or the fact that this card should deal with it really rather well, can make up for the fact that this is a modern title that's been updated frequently over the years, and even in those later benchmark maps, well, you're just not going to see playable frame rates. There were slight inklings around 30 FPS that may indicate simpler scenarios could run okay, but generally this is the Hitman experience you're going to get. 24 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 20 FPS, so at least you've got good frame times, but unfortunately we just don't have enough power or VRAM to get a playable frame rate here. And just to sort of cover all of those older Source games all in one, we've got Black Mesa running with high settings on the Zen map. And I really did want to have the high settings here because you could run lower settings but a higher resolution if you wanted, but given how this game looks, especially in these levels, I just wanted to see all the fancy eye candy. And we did return 81 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 62 FPS, which is really quite surprising. So it's up to you, you can either run this with 1080p and low settings or 720p and high settings. They both sort of work about the same. I mean, I really value the eye candy here, and you do get integer scaling set up on this graphics card, so you can get a very crisp 720p signal. So at the same time, Black Mesa goes to show that any of your Source games you want to play will work. So if you want to play Gary's mod, you want to play Half-Life 2, you want to play CSGO, they are all going to be easier to run than this is. So when it comes to Source games, the HD7770 is still kicking with the latest and greatest of all of them. On the polar opposite of this spectrum though, there was a slight problem with when it came to running S&Box, which is a Source 2 title and one that requests 6GB of VRAM. There was a video on it last week or the week before where we got it running on 1GB, and that involved having to go into Linux and set Vulkan commands and Proton commands and just everything possible to try and eke out a 15 FPS experience. But there have been updates since then which apparently have improved VRAM usage, at least people have told me it has. But unfortunately, when you have 1GB on a 13-year-old, well 14-year-old graphics card now, even with low settings in 720p and FSR set to 50%, which is a new option, we couldn't get in-game and only got a Vulkan error. Always a fascinating benchmark to go back to with Fallout 4 Anniversary, and really this is about where it ends with Bethesda titles. Fallout 4 Anniversary does really want more VRAM than this. It's one of the main downsides to running it. However, it is now more stable than it used to be. It doesn't mean our frame times were perfect, as we saw an average of 48 FPS with 1% lows down to 37 FPS, and we were using low textures and medium settings in a 900p resolution. But this is still more stable than it used to run back in the day. Really what I do is probably try and eke it up just about to 1080p and cap it at 30 FPS, and then do a bit of tweaking around to try and make it stable. That's probably the best way of getting it to run. But Fallout 4 Anniversary does run fine on the card, however the 1GB of VRAM certainly is impacting performance slightly, as our utilization was dropping a lot more now than it used to back in the day. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, with low textures and medium settings and a 900p resolution, I did have to use a 30 FPS external cap to keep the frame rate stable. Unfortunately, it's probably drivers that aren't fully supporting this game, as well as VRAM, and probably a little bit of lack of power as well, but I really wanted to see what the highest quality visuals we could get out of this card was. And I think this is a nice spot to end it on, because look at the visuals that are coming out of what was a 14-year-old entry-level graphics card that was just about on par with the Xbox One, and it's churning out visuals like this above a 720p resolution at a pretty much locked 30 FPS. And I think that's a really good note to end this little benchmark segment of the card on. So, overall performance of the HD7770, and I do have to admit that as much as this has impressed me, I went into this thinking it's going to be time for single digits, and it's going to be a little bit more sad than these actually ended up being, because I have been impressed by it. The fact that GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which is usually how we start a lot of the benchmarks because it's a very popular title, just worked fine, with some settings still on high in a 1080p resolution. That was lovely to see. The fact that Arc Raiders was able to run in a HD resolution, admittedly with low settings, and it's a very clever game that will stop loading in assets if it can't, it was still able to eke out 30 FPS. There have been a lot of impressive takeaways from this, because it's the little card that can. It was the perfect storm. So many of these titles were targeting Xbox One levels of performance, and when you've got in and around that, but with a better processor, usually you can see some pretty impressive results. But the reality is, there are a lot of games that don't work anymore. Fortnite, I just couldn't get it running. Whether it's because the drivers are too old or something else is going on, I'm not sure. If you have got it running, please do tell me. At the same time though, Red Dead Redemption 2, you used to be able to tweak this down low enough that you could get in-game. But with the latest version of the game out, I couldn't get around the out-of-memory errors. And I'm not too sure why this is. I tried different drivers, I tried underclocking, I tried further overclocks, I tried tweaking it down through the config files, and still didn't get anywhere with it. And I'm not too sure why, it's just one of those weird ones where it's been updated enough that it doesn't work. When you start looking at games like Oblivion Remastered, Samson, pretty much any new Unreal Engine 5 title that isn't Arc Raiders, it doesn't run on the card. You are lacking the latest versions of DirectX 12, and even if you can launch it, for example S&Box, it just won't work because you've run out of memory. These are great cards, but the fact is most of them only came with 1 gig. And the 1 gig is really all it needs, because it's very rare that we were entirely VRAM bound, outside a few examples like Hitman and maybe S&Box because we couldn't launch it. So I've been impressed, but it truly is the last days of this graphics card. Now, before we get into a little bit of Linux side testing, there are a couple of bits to get out of the way. When it comes to thermals, if you've got one of the weaker cards, like I used to have back in the day, one of the VTX ones, they can run a little bit hot, usually 70 to 85 degrees, but if you get any model that's remotely decent, so anything from Sapphire, Asus, pretty much any of the reputable manufacturers, you'll see in around 50 to 70 degrees when you're gaming or running a stress test, and in terms of power consumption, you're looking around 60 watts while gaming, and around 85 watts when you're running a Thermark stress test. You've got to keep in mind, Thermark on GCN is one of the most harsh power viruses you can run, so isn't exactly a real-world scenario. In terms of actual power consumption, there's a reason why they give you that Molex connector. This will quite easily run in a 300 watt power supply, provided you aren't overclocking. Now, with the Nemez drivers, there are a few issues here or there. Some people have more luck than me, but generally I cannot get AMD's Relive recorder to work with the modded drivers. It always works fine for me on the stock drivers, but the modded ones I never have much luck. Either way though, when it comes to AMD recording, you can use this as a media card, but for ease of use you're better off doing it through OBS. I fired up Skyrim because that's a good example of one of the games that I used to play on it back in the day. It's one of those games that you could mod, actually a substantial chunk, and play with ultra settings in 1080p at virtually a locked 50 to 60 FPS. Like, it was a pretty good experience. So yeah, it's not power hungry, it's not a generally hot card, it'll work in most systems, and you do get some media capabilities. The drivers do also give you integer scaling, EQAA advancements, really good stuff for retro gaming. In terms of whacking this in a Windows XP PC, it's overkill and drivers do exist out there. Now, I was actually very curious to see the performance of this graphics card over on Linux because, well, when I actually built my first proper computer, I didn't actually have a hard drive for it, everything else had arrived other than the hard drive. So I ran it on a 64GB USB drive, which was running Ubuntu, which at the time, on an FX4300 and a HD7770, you could do quite a lot with OpenGL, but things have come a long way since then, and with Proton and Vulkan, I was actually holding out for a decent chunk of performance. And admittedly, I've used a couple of GCN1 graphics cards using the latest AMD drivers, at least the open source ones, over on Linux, and performance has been spectacular. Unfortunately here, today, I do not know what was going wrong. In the end, we did eventually manage to get into a game, which was CSGO, but the thing is, everything about it should be working. It was reporting running the latest RADV drivers, we had Vulkan running as I could load up Vulkan applications, but all games just refused to work. To the stage where I started investigating the bootloader to completely remove the Radeon drivers and force it entirely onto the latest ones, which then caused HDMI to stop working. So eventually, after I'd done all of that, connected it up with VGA and then gone back into the desktop, it still wouldn't work. Now apparently, from what I've been reading online, a lot of this can be down to the manufacturer, and these RADV drivers are still classed as experimental on GCN1, so sometimes you'll have a manufacturer where there's just no support there and there's tons of workarounds, but I have spent a good half a day trying to get this to work on Linux, and unfortunately I just couldn't get it to work. If anyone's got any ideas, please do let me know, because I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I know a decent chunk about Linux, I know how to change around the drivers, and every other time we've used GCN1, I've managed to get it working, but today, on this Sapphire variant HD7770, it just won't work. Still, at least when it did come to a bit of basic gaming, CSGO was able to launch provided we ran it with OpenGL, and we got around 200 to 300 frames per second. So if that's indicative of anything, it does go to show that there is life for these over on Linux. Unfortunately though, I assumed with running CachyOS, we'd be just in for some smooth sailing, because literally all I've done for most graphics cards is plug them in and it's worked. But today, that didn't seem to be the case, so I'm going to try and fix that, but if anyone's got any suggestions or comments, please do let me know. I have tried plenty of workarounds and solutions that should work. I'm not exactly an entry-level Linux user, I do know my way around the operating system, or the kernel, and it's, yeah, just couldn't work for me today beyond CSGO and OpenGL. So there we have it, AMD's Radeon HD 7770, probably tested on this channel for the last time. Now I may revisit it with a quick Windows XP, Windows Vista, or actually trying to get Linux working on it in a quick members video or something like that. But I think that's the end of the line for this card, because most new games aren't going to work on it. Yes, the occasional indie title will still work, and lots of simpler games do still function. And it's a bit of a weird video, isn't it? Because for £6, it's actually not terrible performance. And given that prices are going up across the board, I mean, just having a cheap entry-level option that you can whack into most systems provided they've got a spare Molex connector and at least 300 watts is certainly welcome. So it does have some value prospects going for it, because the performance hasn't been bad. But it is literally the end of the line. So I think my concluding thoughts are going to go a little bit something like this. As a long-term fan of this card and someone that was recommending them 9 years ago as a great budget option, they finally still have one last option available to you. They are a bargain bin graphics card that will work anywhere from Windows XP up to Windows 11 and Linux if you have more luck than I do. So you can buy these as a cheap solution, but really just save up and get an RX card, because they have a lot more support on both Windows and Linux and just in terms of games in general. So I hope you've all enjoyed this video, and thank you all for sharing your thoughts in the community post. If you have any that you forgot to share, please do leave a comment down below and I will definitely be reading them as I always do. So thank you all for watching, I hope you've enjoyed. It's been a bit of nostalgia and also very interesting to see how well it's still doing. So thank you all for watching, and good night.